Good morning. I'm Morgan Harrington. I am a research manager here at the Australia Institute. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, Awash in the Global Stream, Australian Music versus the Algorithm. It's really good to have you here. Today, we are coming to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Before I introduce our guests, I want to encourage you to take part in our conversation. And you can do so via the chat box. You can type in questions for our panel using the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions too. Toward the end of the webinar, I will put some of your questions to Will and Lucie. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we will remove you from the conversation. And finally, this is a live event and it is being recorded. So the video will be available soon at the Australia Institute's website, australiainstitute.org.au. Now, our guests today are Will Page and Lucie Watson. Lucie Watson is a label founder, marketer and writer, and an advisor and consultant to artists and labels. Just over a year ago, in January 2025, she launched goodtwin, a label services company which aims to help artists from New Zealand and Australia break out in the UK. In the 10 years before founding goodtwin, she built artist services company Platoon, where she helped launch the careers of artists including Billie Eilish, Jorja Smith, and Victoria Monét. You can join the 130,000 others who read her regular Substack newsletter by looking for @goodtwinofficial on Substack. Welcome, Lucie.
Thank you very much.
Now, Will Page is the author of the critically acclaimed book Tarzan Economics, which has been translated into 5 languages and published in paperback under the title Pivot. Will is former chief economist of Spotify and PRS for music. At Spotify, he launched his ongoing and widely anticipated annual report on the global value of music copyright, and at PRS, he saved BB6 music. Will's pioneering work has shown why local artists singing in their own mother tongues are topping the charts on global streaming platforms, except for English, which is something we're going to dig into today. He's a regular contributor to the BBC, the Financial Times, and the Economist. Will also serves as a fellow at the London School of Economics, at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and the Royal Society of the Arts. Will, thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be here. Good morning to those down under.
Now let's start with the big picture. In November, the Australia Institute released the findings of Will's analysis of the top 10,000 artists being streamed in Australia. This captured almost 90% of domestic demand for music. And Will's results showed that between 2021 and 2024, the number of Australian artists streamed in Australia declined by 20%, and the number of times an Australian artist was streamed declined by 30%. So, Will, what's going on? And should we expect things to change?
Well, to give a very simple non-numerical description of what's happening, the Australian recorded music industry is making more and more money, thanks largely to the success of streaming and especially Spotify. But the twist is less and less of it is staying inside Australia. So if we use some very simple round numbers, if the Australian music industry is worth, let's say, $500 million US, less than 50 million of that $500 million is actually going to Australian artists, and it's shrinking. And this is really important for your audience's benefit. It's shrinking in absolute and relative terms. So it's a very peculiar, unprecedented paradox that we're dealing with. And to be clear, there's no Schadenfreude here. I'd love to be proved wrong. And there's no villain here. There's nobody to blame. Nobody else is dealing with what Australia has. But if I can quickly give a very quick 5-minute icebreaker introduction to this broader debate,
Please do.
And walk you through, firstly, what this event is called, Awash. Awash in what? I want to explain that. Secondly, I want to reveal the 2025 figures where there is some encouragement. And then thirdly, I want to ask the question why. And show business is 2 words. I do numbers. Lucie deals with artists. we want to combine here, try and get to why this might be happening. But you chose the title for this event, Morgan, not me, and you used the word awash. What does awash in an algorithm mean? And the key exhibit from the report that we published, and I'm very honored to have Malcolm Turnbull produce the forward for, looked at this. What's happening when it comes to discovery? If there's a human in the mix, my argument goes, we have this identification. There is language, but there is a map. We can identify Australian rock, American rock, and British rock. And the Germans and the Swedes and the Brazilians and the Danish, they have their thing too. If you take the human out of the mix, my hypothesis, I'm not saying it's a scientific fact, but it's a well-informed hypothesis, is you end up with something like this: rock in Swedish, rock in Portuguese, rock in Danish, rock in German, and then English, largely American rock. And just to conclude that slide, what we're saying here is when we discuss the algorithm, they can read language, but they can't read maps. And if you're British, Canadian, or Australian, what we're seeing develop in the music industry is a force for bad. If you're a non-English speaker with a strong national identity, this word globalization seems to be a force for good. So it's asymmetric. Now, that's just a recap on what we said. Let's update the audience with what we now know, because the paper is, what, 6, 7 months old, and we've just completed 2025. So we do this thing called a tornado chart. Technical term, don't worry, walk you through it. We take the top 10,000 artists in Australia. That's important. We're not saying top 10,000 songs or albums. Artists captures 90% of your market. I divide them into 10 deciles, obviously. And what I'm going to look at is in each decile, rank 1 to 1,000, 1,001 to 2,000, 9,001 to 10,000. In each decile, how many Australian artists do I see and how much stream share did they achieve? An observation count on one side, a demand count on the other side. And why do we call them tornadoes? Because if it looks like a tornado, what you're about to see, if it shows the shape of a tornado, it means the Australians are being found at the top of the chart, not at the bottom. So there's two examples in the report, and this is how 2025 looks. And just to give you some very quick headlines, on the left side, the count of artists is actually up slightly. On the right side, the demand for streams for Australian artists is down. So to put a headline on it, it looks like we may have hit a seabed. Maybe we find a new trench to fall down. Maybe we surface to the top, but so far no change. When you look a little bit closer, though, what you see is the presence of the Australian artists is falling in the top tiers and going up in the bottom tiers. That's not a good sign. We're losing the shape of the tornado. Where those Aussies are is towards the bottom of the chart, not the top. But the share is flat, and that's an important consideration. But that's still the case that 92% of all the money being made in Australia leaves Australia because Australian artists make up only 8% of all the streams. So that's a tornado chart. I want to stress to the audience this is your time, not mine. We can bring this back up and go into more detail. But to conclude what we've learned about 2025, it does appear that it's bottomed out. That's a similar story to the UK, by the way. It's not the same story in Canada, which continues on that slope of hope. In the top 100, in the report I mentioned there were 6. There were only 5 Aussies in the top 100 last year. Rufus and Vance drop out, and Tame Impala gets in. And I should hesitate to say this, but the Wiggles are still the #1 artist in Australia. And they've actually gone up in the charts, number 44. So the Wiggles are on the rise. And then thirdly, I don't want to discuss the names of artists who have suffered in this, awful predicament Australian music now faces, but we went through a long list of the artists who had dropped out, and we noticed a lot of the artists which are just falling away from the charts are those who didn't bother to export, which is going to bring something that you're an expert in, as your job is exporting these artists in the UK. So to close this off, and then we get straight into dialogue and hopefully into Q&A, you have to ask why this is happening. I'm just going to throw a bunch of reasons out there. The algorithm is an obvious one. It's not the only one, and it might not be the right one. You can consider the work ethic, the inertia, the charts, the risk aversion, tall poppy syndrome, which is where I defer to Lucie, radio, streaming, the algorithm, of course, cost disease, the sheer cost of bands touring in Australia compared to bands touring in Canada. The journey from Vancouver to Seattle is a lot less than it is from Vegas to London. And then finally, just to stress this word globalization, we define it in real time. I'm going to change the definition after we have this discussion. But why is it that countries as small as Denmark and as big as Brazil are going completely local? where countries like the UK, Australia, and Canada are just being dominated by the United States of America. With that, let me hand you back to Morgan.
Thanks, Will. So Lucy, uh, could you tell us a little bit about, in your experience, whether tall poppy syndrome is something that is still a factor in the popularity of Australian music?
Yes, it absolutely is. Tall poppy syndrome and how it relates to artists is that artists feel that they can't really be really ambitious. They feel that they can't celebrate their success and their wins. And that's just a symptom of Australia and New Zealand culture. Tall poppy syndrome is rife. And so in Will's article, I did talk about validation culture, and that is where artists actually need to go overseas and sort of get these credibility stamps with certain things happening in other markets. And once there is that validation, it actually gives them more credibility back home in the artist's home country because, suddenly they can actually be taken seriously. They can admit that they're an artist. And in turn, a lot of it really breeds loyalty and fandom back home. And I've seen that in New Zealand and I've seen it in Australia. The other thing as well is, Will mentioned these artists that aren't exporting and they're falling off the list. Within the last 10 years, we've been really lucky that we can allow algorithms to go and build online communities for us in all of these pockets in the world. And as Will's paper shows us, we can no longer rely on algorithms to really push those artists out. He talked about the one-way valve system, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But these artists are really struggling now to get international exposure overseas if they're just doing it from Australia. So actually, those artists that will go into market and hopefully spend some time and build, emotional connections with fans in all of these territories across the world will hopefully be the ones that sustain a long-term career.
Yeah, just to add to that, there's an expression that we're using over here now, which is the algorithm is the new boss. That decides who gets promoted and fired in the company. That decides who breaks. Humans didn't break Benson Boone, an algorithm broke Benson Boone. So you use that term when you think about this.
Mhm.
All right. And so to dig into that for Australian artists in particular, why is the algorithm being the boss a problem for what you're showing in your slides there? Why can't we rely
Um,
on the algorithms?
yeah, well, you've taken the human out of the mix. I think that's the quandary that we're now in. You can't sit on a black leather sofa and pitch a song to an algorithm. You don't have those communal moments where we all listen together. And I don't want to sound nostalgic here, but it is something that is missing. And the best way I can capture this, I'm going to switch lanes slightly and talk about the festival industry. But we were looking at the plight of British festivals. Festivals like Reading and Leeds didn't even sell half their tickets last year, which is a travesty considering, they are like, a rites of passage. When you get your GCSEs, you go to Reading and get trashed. And yeah, Glenn MacDonald had this great observation. He said, when you look at a multi-genre festival poster, it looks like a playlist that's been created for somebody else because we're so used to the phone speaking just to me and Lucy's phone
Mhm.
speaking just to Lucy. So this is way out of my comfort zone. This is about culture, not economics, but it's something to consider.
Okay, so Lucy, in January last year, you launched goodtwin with the aim of helping artists from Australia and New Zealand cut through in the UK and internationally. So, in your experience, has streaming made it harder for artists from Australia and New Zealand? And where are the opportunities for newer, smaller, emerging artists?
Yes, I mean, just to reassure everyone, streaming has gotten hard across the entire world. It's really, really hard for artists to make a living off streaming now, and it's just not the same as it was 10 years ago. The problem with Australia and New Zealand artists is that they're obviously operating in much smaller markets, so they are impacted by that a lot. But yeah, I mean, yeah, what can be done to help these artists and to help emerging artists? I mean, Will in his research outlined a lot of great solutions, or at least he put forward some ideas of what could be done to really help support emerging artists in Australia at a time when streaming is just really, really hard. And some of those were subsidizing festivals and events and venues and making sure that Australian artists are, really put on the bills for those things. Having a big emphasis on human curation and tastemakers and editorial to make sure that Australian music is front and center. And one that I really, really agree with is around having more structure and more pathways, more sort of foundational support for emerging artists who, are thinking long term about career growth and ultimately that will help them go from that long tail that Will describes in his report and really help those artists, start to break out and build audiences.
Quickly add to that as well. There's one I thought we do my homework before addressing this audience, which really matters to me. There's one great example of what Canada does. Canada will use taxpayers' money to keep Canadian artists inside Canada. But if, let's say, Lucy is a promising film director in Canada, they use taxpayers' money to send Lucy to Hollywood because that's the best place for her to be, to leave the country of Canada. And inside Hollywood, they have SOCAN, which is like a sort of guerrilla operation to make sure that Canadian film directors use Canadian songs in those Hollywood built movies. So they're kind of behind enemy lines. And I just wonder whether like you could have the infrastructure for Australians and New Zealanders here in the UK or in the United States. So when the artists come, every opportunity is explored. So while they're on that road, and that road is going to cost them a lot of money, six figures easily to be on that road, they're leaving no stone unturned in terms of the opportunities.
Yeah, and I think that is reflected in the slides you were showing just before, where the performance of Canadian artists hasn't declined. So it appears that those strategies are working.
Well, you get artists like Arcade Fire, which is an interesting one because the bigger they got, the more state support they got. In Britain, our mindset would be the bigger you get, the more we wean you off the subsidy. But Canada backed a winner with that one and took them to from pubs to theatres to arenas to stadiums. So yeah, there's just lessons you can learn there, but you cannot be in denial about the true cost of touring for Australian artists. And I used to be a treasury economist back in a previous life. There's an element of market failure there. If there's fewer tours, you end up in this spiral that Australians have been well aware of for the past 5 years. So supporting artists getting on the road is an absolutely crucial one. And just to quickly recap on what we put forward in the paper for those who haven't read it, and I'll just paraphrase very simply. There are Canadians on this call who can talk in more detail. But in Canada, when you get 15 dates in Europe, the Canadian government, through the Star Maker Fund, says, I'll subsidize every additional date. And the economics is rock solid. If you're willing to play in Glasgow, then the marginal cost of you doing another gig in Edinburgh is nothing. And 15-date tours become 30-date tours. So that way of expanding the presence of Australians and New Zealanders when they're on the road, I think is absolutely crucial.
Yes, and we have the tyranny of distance to contend with on top of that. So,
Yeah.
oh, okay, just a reminder, I can see some questions coming in through the question box. Please remember to put them in there. You can upvote each other's questions. I know that Will and Lucy are keen to answer some of them. But before we get to those, Will, your report, as you said earlier, found that although Australia's revenue from the music industry has increased significantly since 2021, so it's up 25%. Much less of it is going to the Australian artists who created the music. So there's been a 30% decline. So how can this be explained? Where does this increasing amount of money come from, and where is it going to, if not to the artists?
Yeah, so firstly, where the money is coming from, when you look at the IFPI yearbook, it's coming from subscribers, people willing to cough up the equivalent of here in the UK, £12 a month to access all Welsh music offline, ad-free and on demand. And Spotify should take a bow there because when I was in Australia in 2014, third time I've ever visited a country when I cried when I left because I didn't want to leave, um, all people talked about was piracy. Now think about that. Every panel, every conference, every meeting, piracy. We need three strikes and you're out. Nobody discusses piracy now because Spotify and the streaming services delivered on their promise. So the money is coming in from subscription, but where is it going? It's going to North America, predominantly the United States, add Canada, Drake, The Weeknd, Justin Bieber are up there in the Australian charts, add Barbados for Rihanna as well. And that is not uncommon to what the Brits and the Canadians are experiencing too. And let me just put a pin in that point. When you look at A, in Britain at least, if you're a British artist worth your salt, you get signed and managed out of the United States. Um, B, I think 73% of our chart revenue now is going to the United States. And C, and this is a crazy one, I got to work with Oasis last year. By the way, Noel said to me that the concerts in Australia were the best of the entire tour. Um, but how can it be the case that in Britain, Eminem ranks above Oasis for 2025? Can somebody jump on the chat bar and explain how that is physically, mentally, and emotionally possible after last year, the biggest cultural moment in our country? Some rapper from Detroit ranks above Oasis. But that's what we're dealing with in our country, and that's what you're dealing with in yours.
So people are buying these subscriptions to streaming services, but they're listening to artists predominantly from the United States. So that's where the money flows.
Mhm.
Correct. And that affects return on investment. On your label side, you have to do these calculations when you sign artists, and you can see how it's going to kick in on the return of investment. And that's where
Mm.
the problem gets worse and worse, as your own headlines down under have been documenting for the past 5 years.
Okay. Uh, so Lucy, I think we've kind of preempted this question, but why is the export market so important for artists from Australia and New Zealand? And what could help more Australian artists cut through in the UK?
Well, I have a lot of conversations with Australia and New Zealand artists, and especially those who have come over to live in London to try and grow their audience. And the conversation is always the same. They feel like they've hit a ceiling very quickly in terms of the local opportunities that are on offer for them, whether it be in New Zealand or Australia, just because the markets are smaller, the opportunities are finite, the audience is smaller, and especially if they're in a niche genre that actually would do better in outside, New Zealand and Australian territories, then they really feel like that's the reason that they have to get out and they have to try and build these audiences. I say, Will and I, when we're not living here for the lifestyle or the weather, we're here for the opportunity for our careers. And it's exactly the
You saying the
same.
weather's better back in Scotland?
That's a fair point. But we're here for the opportunity. That's why we live here, and those are the sacrifices that we make. And it is the same for artists. So building overseas is just also not just about the audience growth, but it is also about trying to build the credibility as well, as I mentioned before, that validation. Um, One thing was I recently had a conversation with Leonie Conley, who's a very established music manager, an Australian manager, and I believe she's based between London and LA. And we had a really interesting conversation, and we were saying, wouldn't it be so interesting if instead of bringing artists over for these showcases that have run for a couple of decades, that don't necessarily convert to, publishing signings, record label deal signings, live agent signings? What if we, took some risks and we actually did something different with that funding and we funded a house in London for Australian artists so that they could come into market, all of their savings go towards their living costs and creative costs and everything for just living on the ground in London. But if their accommodation was covered, wouldn't that just be so interesting to test and see, if that was sustainable to be able to come into market and actually spend time here planting seeds?
I dig that. That's like invest in the train tracks so we can run the trains,
Yeah,
give
yeah.
the infrastructure to cover this whole prohibitive cost base. That's a cool
Yeah,
idea.
yeah, because it just I think she agreed. These showcases, that's not how people get signed anymore. I've met live agents who've signed artists from social media without ever seeing them play live. The reality is that all the people sitting in these labels and publishers and booking agents, they've got full rosters, and there's more than enough artists to go around. So actually redirecting some of those funds and actually taking some risks and thinking about new ways to actually help Australian artists on the ground. Equally, I'm here, I'm on a mission to help Australia and New Zealand artists. I understand all three territories and contexts. And, what if there were more me's who are here on the ground and who can really help, build that bridge between the territories? Wouldn't that be interesting?
Yeah,
Yeah,
one
sorry.
constructive addition to that is, at least here in the UK and the United States, you have companies like OpenStage co-brand Lalo, which are it's a quiet revolution happening in the music industry where big artists, small artists are extracting their fan base data out of the record label and managing it themselves.
Mhm.
For better or for worse, it just suits them. Look at the Radiohead tour, which I worked on. No mention of Ticketmaster there. 8 million requests for tickets, all registered on their CRM system. So if that's happening at the artist level, given the unique circumstances of Australians and New Zealanders, could there be an open stage solution for Australians and New Zealanders? And I say that because I remember seeing Ocean Alley at the Camden Roundhouse and speaking to the manager saying, you've sold out the Roundhouse twice. It's a huge success, right? But the counter argument was, all you did was play to Australians. So is that breaking Australian bands to Australians in Britain a success, yes or no? There's a lot of Aussies and Kiwis here. If there's a way of databasing them, there'd be a lot more support for the bands that would come here. Ditto United States, ditto Canada. So
Mhm.
there's stuff that can be done on that side which goes way beyond what we offered in the paper.
Mhm.
Yes, and I should thank Will and Lucy for joining us from the UK tonight, where it must be very late indeed. So thank you for all the sacrifices that you've made on behalf of
We're honored to be
Australian
here.
music.
This matters to us both.
Now I can see the questions are coming in to the question and answer box, so please keep them coming. We are going to move on to those soon. But another one from me. So just last week we had Triple J's Hottest 100 countdown. Now these have become both Triple J and the Hottest 100 have become lightning rods for criticism for Australia's music woes. This year, the number one spot went to Olivia Dean's Man I Need, and the track was absolutely everywhere. It was on social media, it was on commercial radio. It's not generally the kind of thing that in the past has been in a Hottest 100 countdown. So I'm just wondering what the role of radio is in all of this when social media has become the main source of music discovery. And what does that reality mean for Australian music?
I don't think radio has helped itself. Ditto many other legacy media companies like newspapers. They've shot themselves in the foot so many times with the way they've tried to adapt to digital. But in the paper, my idea was why doesn't the radio industry work with, not against, the streaming industry? Was it Marshall McLuhan who talked about the medium and the message? Triple J could be a really big YouTube channel if it concedes that it's lost the war in being a really big radio channel. There's different means to the same end, which is to get those communal one-to-many broadcast moments back into culture. So, yeah, my big wish for the years that you've been whinging about the Hot 100 is to take a different means to the same end, which is there's an audience out there. You're just not going to reach them through the radio format anymore, but you could reach them through things like YouTube.
So it sounds like between all of these things, so we've got decline in radio audiences, and just earlier there you mentioned a decline in ticket sales for even those very big internationally prominent Reading Festival kind of events. So it seems that the whole experience of music is moving away from what you're talking about there, a one to many or a many and many experience to a much more one-on-one kind of phenomenon.
I think so. I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. I don't want to exaggerate it, but just a quick observation from the festivals this year, at least here in the UK, we're selling a lot of 1 day tickets,
Mhm.
not 3 days, because that 1 day's got the band that speaks to me. But I don't want to go for days 2 or 3 because they're not in my algorithm, they're not in my playlist. That
Mm.
culture is interesting. And also remember an obvious point, we invest in our homes. We invest in smart TVs, we pay for a Netflix account. So there's an opportunity cost in going out when you've already paid for Netflix. So there's a bunch of things going on there. But yeah, those communal moments is what breaks bands from zero to hero. And I think I don't know, I'm the student, you're the professor here. We don't have those communal moments as often as we did.
No,
Or am I
no.
just being old? I don't know.
No, no, we definitely don't anymore. But yeah, like you said, festivals are going to more curated lineups for one genre, really focusing on that genre for 1 day. And that is, yeah, that's really, really interesting. My other take on radio, I feel, is that it's always going to be an amazing way to amplify music. And if Australian artists can be discovered more and really championed more by curators and tastemakers, then hopefully that builds enough of an audience to go on radio. The other thing worth mentioning is that I believe in New Zealand there is still a quota of New Zealand acts being played on the radio. Maybe introducing more of that might help.
Okay, thanks. So thanks everyone for sending in your questions here. I'm going to get to those now. So Gavin Miller has asked, what can governments do here, in particular Australian governments? And realistically, can we expect governments to help Australian artists and art in general, given the way that arts and humanities have been treated in the past?
Well, your investment in music is one part of the arts. I'll do some rough maths in my head here. I think the Canadian government, and your currencies are probably comparable, is pumping 80 to 100 million into music this year. And that's taking out Quebec as a special case. And if you do the maths on what the Australian government has dedicated, it's still, I don't know, what, a quarter of that sum? And to reiterate, the cost of getting from Vancouver to Seattle is a lot less than getting from Brisbane to Europe. So money is a factor, but money doesn't solve all problems. It's spending that money wisely. And I think the interventions here have to be on the infrastructure side. I love the idea that you had about the house or subsidizing accommodation whilst you're here to pick up more gigs. And then the one that's in the paper of just, investing and expanding what was already happening. Think about the sunk cost, getting that band into a plane to fly out, the marginal cost of being on the road, and the marginal benefit that the government can bring through an intervention that takes 15-day tours and makes them 30-day tours. It's you can't break Europe by flying out here and doing 15 shows and flying home again. It's not going to work. So what was the purpose of that tour? You need to be out here for longer and touring more. The work ethic is a really important issue.
It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll.
I was tempted to say that. By the way, that was sung by a Scotsman in the band that was three-fifths Scottish, so I won't have anybody claiming that as Australian.
You can fight that fight on your own.
I'll concede.
Now, Kimberly Wheeler has asked, Will, when you talk about $50 million going to Australian artists, does that mean total in royalties? So is it after consideration of any split between record companies or other rights holders and artists?
Absolutely great question. I'll give a written response to you afterwards, and you can forward it on if you have details. This is top line. This is gross. So it's not actually what gets the artist's bank account, which is where the story gets really quite depressing. So I don't know, you could take the average royalty as, 20, 25, 30% of that 50 million is actually getting to Australian artists' bank accounts. In addition, there'll be payments to APRA, which then pay the publishers and the songwriters as well. But I'm just using rough maths to say you got a $500 million US business, and less than 50 million of that $500 million is finding its way into the Australian part of the food chain. The rest, if I use the word repatriation here, is being repatriated back to headquarters in the United States. And just reiterate, less return, less investment, and that's the economics of this problem.
Okay, thanks very much. I hope that answers your question, Kimberly.
I would say
Now,
just a quick add there, the
please do.
royalty rates I'm seeing for artists now are going up, up, up. So yeah, maybe it's 30% of that 50 million, not 25. So
All right.
more
So,
of the money is making its way through to the artist bank accounts. That's my point.
what's going on there? Why are the royalties going
I
up?
think the bargaining power of artists and the way that deals are being structured and the workload, how much is the artist going to do themselves versus the label? So yeah, I think it's a great success story of streaming is there's more money and more of it is making its way through to the artists. The challenge here, as we've already discussed, is less of those artists are Australian. So
Still
you have to take a balanced view on this.
So the artists, in some ways, have an increasing amount of power here.
Yeah, absolutely. And then don't forget DistroKid, $20 a year, retain 100% of your copyright, see 100% of your revenue. Not advocating that as a model, but it's important to know that that option does exist. So those options did not exist before Spotify came along.
Okay. The next question is from Melanie. Melanie says, much of this considers label signed artists. Most of Australia's artists are not signed. She says the estimate is around 80%. These artists are almost completely invisible and unpaid in the globalized streaming melee. But even Music Australia has told us that they won't fund the pack because it deliberately and only surfaces unsigned independent artists. How does Australia address this, even if our grant makers can't see one of the basic issues, that we have no pipeline or viable distribution platforms for new artists?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, that is the reality. And it's, it's the same in New Zealand and it is probably the same in the UK. I have a label working with emerging artists, and everything that we're putting focus on is trying to get these artists to actually stop thinking about Spotify metrics, stop thinking about Spotify playlists, and to actually start owning their audience and really trying to get them obsessed with direct to fan. And that is, really starting to build their own fan bases, both inside their home countries and abroad. Um, yeah, I mean, it is incredibly challenging, and right now it does feel like artists are really having to own the 0 to 60 of audience growth and momentum themselves, and that's, independent artists across the board. And then when they've sort of got to that 60%, that's when often the labels will come and, come and sign them and open those industry doors for them. So it's, I guess the question here is how can we really help and nurture and find those systems and pathways to help that, that effectively is the long tail that you described.
And just one option, I think it was Melanie who asked the question. One suggestion there is, if you look at Canada, you have the Star Maker Fund, which is available to everyone, but then they have a much bigger factor fund, which is really only indie and do-it-yourself artists. So they have a pot of government cash, and they deliberately discriminate as to who gets their hands on it. And that's just an interesting suggestion. I'm not advocating it, but just to see how Canadians recognize that some need that help more than others. I'll just throw that
Mm.
out there as a something to perhaps look into.
Yeah,
So,
and it's the same in New Zealand. We've got the NZ on air funding, which really does help build that structure around early stage artists by giving them, funding for a single or a project, and that really is enough to bolster them up and be able to, actually start to build an audience and release music.
Yeah.
yeah, oh, that sounds really interesting. Our next question comes from Andrew Stone. He asks, what is the impact of US-centric media and TikTok, and how is it contributing to the discovery and consumption? Major labels are centralizing their teams to the US. There is subsidized international touring, mostly in the US, into Australia and, sorry, mostly US, into Australia, and Australian audiences are attending. But the visa costs, US dollar conversion, and inflated touring costs mean it's virtually impossible to go the other way. It's not a fair fight.
Mm.
Uh, don't we know it over here? One of the three major record labels here has just fired around about half of its headcount and now reports not to the global HQ, but the American HQ of that global record label. Um, sign of the times.
Mhm.
Sign of the times, the country that produced the Beatles and the Proclaimers, when you think about it. Um, so yeah, and I want to reiterate not just that we call it US bombing when US labels sign British artists, US management companies take those artists. And maybe for the artist, that's the right thing to do. Maybe the numbers are better. Maybe that's a rational decision. But for an industry, it means we're getting hollowed out, for better or for worse. That needs to be addressed. And then just to stress the cost issues that Andrew cited there are absolutely relevant and need to be explained to Tony Burke, your culture minister. Just one little bit of theory there, if you want to geek out on this, there's a topic called cost disease, which won the Nobel Prize many years ago, which says for all the technological advances where you can do things cheaper, Lucy's got a smartphone, it's also a scanner. She doesn't need to buy a scanner. You can do so much more. It still takes four people to perform in a quartet. That is, there are some cost savings which reach the world of technology and society, but don't reach this world. And governments have to understand that cost disease element add on top exchange rates, add on top inflation, add on top visas to realize there's a bit of a stranglehold, a monetary stranglehold on getting Australian culture heard at home and abroad.
Spare a thought for all those ska bands out there.
Yeah,
Great time to be a DJ with a USB stick. It's not a great time to be,
the 12 piece.
but yeah, cost disease is a relevant topic. Okay, next question.
All right. So Patrick says, I suppose Cory Doctorow's ideas are the elephant in the room when it comes to musicians surviving off streaming. Is there a way for artists to collectively negotiate with the large platforms without being trapped into the traditional system?
I would disagree with the premise of that question quite strongly, and that needs to be debated over beer, not on a webinar. But artists are achieving things outside of streaming. Streaming is not there to be the be all and end all of the business. Nobody said it would, and nobody should think that way. Just one little sidebar to that. If you look at the growth of vinyl, some people might frown and say it's niche. Well, it's a tiny part. It's a huge part of the business. And I did a paper op-ed in Billboard which said, why don't you put the vinyl out first so your super fans can get it, and then put it on streaming second, where the mainstream fans can get it. The gaming industry does this, the theater industry does this. Seems like a rational idea. Kiwi band Fat Freddy's Drop did it, and I don't want to disclose figures, but they banked a whole ton of cash before it went on streaming. And Anderson .Paak did it. Quite a lot of artists are doing that. So it's just don't think that streaming is going to pay all your bills. You're naive. It's part of a mix, and it's to exploit those other opportunities around it, which matter most, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, streaming has slowed down across the board, now it has to be obviously part of
Yeah, the party's over.
yeah, it has to be part of, the strategy. And right now it's very topical too. A lot of artists have left Spotify and left streaming platforms because they're just not earning any money from it. So they're sort of saying, what is the actual point? But for the way that I coach and work with artists, I always say, streaming's a massive and important part of your strategy, but it's definitely not the strategy. And especially if we're going after revenue, that right now is where direct to fan and really building audiences online and offline in real life are where the revenue is going to come from, making merch, selling merch.
And you were saying that back in 2017 when a young Billie Eilish was starting out. I remember the articles as well. Just one quick thing on vinyl too. Firstly, think about gifting. One thing we don't do in the music business is gift anymore. It used to be a huge part of our industry. It was gifting in the run up to Christmas. You gift vinyl. And two, the fun fact, in Britain at least, 55% of vinyl buyers don't own a record player.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, we're even seeing a resurgence in CDs right now.
Yeah. And
CDs are
Bluetooth operated cassette players.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not to say that's the only thing. It's to say factor that into the mix when you start to approach a strategy of monetizing your music. Next question, Morgs.
So, sorry, does that mean that they're giving those vinyls away, or they're just buying them to put them on the shelf?
Buying them to put them on the shelf. Yeah. Yeah. They, people are desperate for a collector's item now, something that's tangible. Even cassette tapes. There's a label here in London that solely releases music on cassette tapes.
Yeah, right. I'd never thought of just how valuable that fetish item is, but that's really interesting to know. Lucie, if I could just ask you a follow-up question on that. If the artists are deciding to leave streaming services, what are they doing instead? How are they choosing to distribute their music?
Yes, well, I would say Bandcamp is the winner here right now. And I'm pretty sure Bandcamp users, are just going up and up every month, especially not even just for artists who are leaving Spotify, but even just the narrative in the industry that streaming is just not a good money earner for artists. There's just been so much talk about that in the last year or so. I think even now, consumers of music are also starting to become a little more conscious, and they're also going to Bandcamp as a way that they can really help their artists. Others are just releasing music through physical. What I would say is stay on those streaming platforms because it is, even though it is harder, it's harder to push your music. Streaming's not paying what it used to. it is still incredible to see that when you release music, you do still get into all these corners of the world that you just couldn't get to if it wasn't for these platforms like Spotify and Apple Music.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. Our next question comes from Gemma Hooper. She says, outside of live performance, what strategies have been tried to refine Australia's music consumption patterns, or for Australia to refine the music consumption patterns for other territories? Spotify and other streaming services are currently a dominant set of platforms, but they don't have to be. Have any other governments that you've surveyed tried to influence that mix in favor of platforms where music ownership and self-curation have a higher profile in the mix?
Um, it's a deep question.
Mm.
There are things that I think you actually advocated, which I take a different position on. Again, we go to Canada briefly because it's English speaking, it's comparable population. Canada had the CanCon quotas, which is 35% of radio airplay had to be Canadian content. I frankly oppose that, although I get pressured on it all the time. Interesting fact, when they introduced the CanCon quotas, the radio stations to object the fact that they had to look at passports before they created playlists. What they did was they played Nickelback between midnight and 7 a.m. every day.
I think that sadly is the reality.
I filled up my quota. You didn't have to say
Yeah.
anybody was listening to it. So there's, there are challenges with that. I don't know. A flippant response to this, I'd love to unpack it more, but when I read the headlines that have been coming out of Australia for the past 5 years, there's a lot of blame. There's a lot of blame. There's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lot of whinging. Um, both horses have got to pull the same plow is what my mum and dad said about marriage, and I think that's what needs to happen. Like I said, like why can't YouTube get into bed with Triple J? Why are the streaming services on one side of the street and why are the radio services on the other side of the street? I think given the unique challenges the country faces, you guys have got to what do they call it? Team Australia. You guys got to pull together a bit more. I don't want that to sound in any way patronizing. Just all I hear about is finger pointing.
Okay, so I can see in the chat a few people are talking about the Ossify campaign. I'm not sure if you were
Yeah.
following that. Yeah, so do you think that was a success? Is that those
So,
kinds
so,
of initiatives?
so some so brought to light in the homework done for this webinar, I'm understanding that the Ossify campaign is affecting public performance spaces. So I thought this is just for Lucy and her phone, but I'm now beginning to understand that it's public performance. That's pretty important because a public performance, be it a bar, be
Mm.
it a restaurant chain, is one to many. It's broadcast. So affecting that public performance in a chain in the UK, like I'll just use Nando's, a chicken place here, is not just one restaurant, it's hundreds, thousands of restaurants. And I applaud that. Like hitting the public performance market is a great way to enter a broadcast through the back door. And just to wrap that one up, there's the great story told in my book, Pivot or Tarzan Economics as a hardback about Megan Trainor, all about that base, where it spiked on Shazam before it spiked on radio, before it spiked on streaming, before it spiked on sales. And we couldn't work out where the Shazam tags were coming from. Then I learned a year later that it was coming from Starbucks. Starbucks created a song in every one of their coffee shops. 36 million Americans go into Starbucks and order, wait, serve, and slurp shit, crap, poor coffee every morning. It's a radio station. It's the biggest radio station in
Mm.
America. And that coffee shop broke all about that base. So that tells you there is a role for broadcast and breaking music in these spaces. We just haven't tapped it. So if Ossify is looking at that, then take a bow because that's definitely a good bit of hunting ground there to go into.
Mhm.
All right. Now, following on for that, Jess Keeley asks, can we hear about strategies to combat the algorithm issue? Lots of other areas here are about strategies to exist outside of it. Everyone working in the industry at a commercial level needs to already be skilled up in that. So, yeah, what, if anything, could be done about the algorithm?
And putting a human back into the mix would be a good one. Valuing human curation per se would also be additionally helpful. I think with it, when you debate the algorithm, though, there is a caveat to this, which is that's not the only way that you do your streaming. I put it into three buckets. Lucy has her commute to work playlist that she's assembled. Lucy has her algorithm, which kicks in when those playlists are completed, or should she choose an algo playlist? And then there's human curation as well. And in those three buckets, you have to be careful because I think the majority of streaming is inertia. It's doing what we've always done. My Spotify Wrapped is its 10th year of being in excess, and more in excess. It's all that dominates my playing. I always do what I've always done. So then you have to step back and say, well, we can beat up the algorithm, but maybe the streaming services are not where discovery is happening. It's where we go to do our listening. And once you understand that, for better or for worse, it changes the debate again. So I would, stress putting a human back into the mix is really important, but also not to be naive to the fact that the vast majority of listening that Lucy will do with her streaming service is her own choice. The algorithm will be silver, but gold is her own playlist, her commute to work playlist. And that's inertia. Inertia is a problem when it comes to breaking music. It's not a problem if that's what the consumer wants to do.
Mm. And sorry, just to add there, I also I really do feel like we're back in a era of, outdoor advertising again, and actually just trying to get these artist names and albums back in people's psyches, because if I'm about to cook dinner and I open Apple Music and I just want to put on something, I don't want to put on one of the curated playlists, but I know there's an album or an artist that I really want to put on. If I've come across that artist on a billboard or a poster or even seen it on my phone, then that artist is in my psyche and that's the one that I'm going to choose.
I don't know how we apply that to the question asked, but you're onto something there. For years, people were like poo-pooing the concept of paying for billboards. And then very quietly, very discreetly, Netflix bought all the billboard companies in California and the West Coast of the United States because they knew what made things stand above the crowd. So, again, sounding a bit nostalgic here, but some of those old media tools matter when the
They do,
challenge
yeah.
is how do you draw attention and stand above a crowd?
So you stick out from the online crowd by going offline.
Absolutely.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so Tim Wilson asks, well, he says that streaming services currently operate on a pro rata model. A giant
hmm
royalty pool is divided according to market share, meaning the biggest artists get the largest slices. He asks, would a fixed payment per stream be a more advantageous system, as it would directly benefit growth for the vast number of mid-level and independent artists who make up most of the market share, and therefore allow more money flowing through the industry?
Um, Again, this is one I'll pick up and email Morgan with, and you can forward it on if you have the details. But well versed in this debate, the pro rata model is so simple. If you get 1% of all the streams in Australia last month, you get 1% of all the money. It's that simple. Even drummers can understand it. Sorry, Morgan. Um,
Well,
there are many, many alternatives out there. The user-centric model, I think, is where he was alluding, which is you ring fence Morgan's bank account to just Morgan streams. Artist-centric, which looks at whether some artists are worth more than others. Introducing weighting, artist growth. Should you tax the rich and give to the poor? That's an interesting one to explore that I developed for the indie labels here in the UK. And then my own model, which is as a sort of step towards introducing duration, introducing completion. Songs that are completed are worth more, songs that are not completed are worth less. All of that's fascinating stuff if you want to geek out on it. I think when you step back, the interesting thing to this question is we've had the pro rata model for over 20 years. If you look at the collecting societies, APRA, for example, they never, ever, ever treat music to have the same value. There's weighting, there's time of day, there's duration, there's all these crazy formulas in their distribution pot, which means that songs aren't worth the same. And I find that interesting. The old world varies the price of music. The new world just has communism. So I encourage people to debate this, but debate it with respect to fairness, not greed.
okay, thanks, Will. Melanie has asked if you guys are aware of the Pack Music Cooperative, who have been around working on these issues for about 8 years, she says.
No, I'm not.
No, but there's various others who are working these issues as well. So Um, yeah,
We'll look into it for sure.
changing the distribution model is a really interesting area to focus on. And
All
by the
right.
way, just to give Melanie and the previous caller, if I use that radio expression, um, you're discussing here a subject called fair division, which is rarely taught in economics, but just very quickly, crash course in fair division. How do you achieve a fair division of royalties? How do you achieve a fair division of a fixed good? Imagine there's a cake and Will and Lucy are really hungry, really hungry. How do you fairly divide the cake? You give Will the knife. Aha, I have the power to cut the cake. But then you give Lucy the right to choose which half, which forces me to cut it as evenly as possible because you would exploit the advantage. Full stop there, but just to stress, if people are interested in this debate, there is actually a lot of very fascinating academic literature to support what is a fair allocation of royalties.
Feel a part two coming on.
Okay, look, I think we're going to have to make this the last question, but Andrew Stone asks, what are some examples of human curation done well? Are there success stories around the world that are punching above their weight?
I'll go for, I cited
Mm.
KCRW Radio in the paper as a Santa Monica-based LA serving NPR public radio that still remains relevant. The joke is if you go on a date in LA, the first question you ask is, do you listen to KCRW? Because the answer is no, it's a bad date. Um, and the work that they've done, they were the first, 2012, they were the first to integrate Spotify, playlist buttons into their shows. Hear it on radio, go straight to Spotify. The first to do live streaming of their yardstick show, Morning Becomes Eclectic, where you can offer comments. Where you can offer comments. Music has to be two-way. Comments per views ratio is the only thing we discuss over here in the UK now. It's the only metric that matters. Lucy's got 10 million views, but only 50 comments. I've got 1 million views, but 50,000 comments. You work with quality, not quantity. So I think that's one. And then I would flag, human curation in the UK, Six Music on a Saturday. Lots of people listen to it, but they listen to it all day.
Mm.
You listen to Huey from Funneling Criminals in the morning, you listen to Giles in the afternoon, you listen to Craig Charles in the evening. And that expression, that radio expression, don't touch that dial, it seems to work for that. So
Hmm.
yeah,
And also, sorry, I was just going to add in there, same with NTS radio. That's still, do you know NTS
yeah.
radio? Yeah, that's another one, that really is human curated and that you just roll on for the whole Saturday.
Uh,
And someone I do want to point out in Australia who's just, the profiles growing really, really well is Derek G.
Thank you for
Derek
saying
G from
him.
Sydney. And yeah, I see what he's doing and I really do believe that we're, as consumers of music, we've just been forced to just listen to anything that's thrown in our face. And this year, I really believe that we are going back to human curation and tastemakers. And, we no longer want algorithms to just serve us music. We want to go to someone whose taste we trust and see what albums they would recommend. Another one is Somewhere Soul, who's a UK-based jazz lover, and he's built a huge, huge channel just from recommending jazz and soul albums. So people like that are, yeah, going to
Yeah,
be really important.
YouTube needle drop, I think 6 million views, reaction videos, first to comment.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole culture of human curation happening under our radar. I just don't sometimes we don't give it enough light, give it enough weight. But Derek G, based down under, he'd be a great person to address this question as well. James Barksdale said there's only two ways you can make money, bundling and unbundling. And sometimes I think the pendulum swings from human curation to algo. And if you listen to Derek G, it gives you belief that it might well start swinging back again.
Oh, well, thanks for the tip. I hope everyone wrote that down. Now, we are going to have to end it there. So, thank you once again to Will Page and Lucie Watson for joining us all the way from the UK. And thank you all for coming along and for your great questions. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube and to our podcasts, After America, Follow the Money, and Dollars and Cents. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.